Welcome to Digit Debates. I'm Jackie O'Reilly, co-director with Mark Stewart at Leeds of the Centre, and we're really delighted to have Duncan here today to talk about how we understand the future of work with more of a historical perspective. Duncan, as is written on the website, is Emeritus Fellow of Nuffield College, Oxford, CBE, and Fellow of the British Academy. And all the details are on the website, along with a series of important publications he's made, both historically and more recently, and helping us understand some of the issues we're dealing with. And one of the reasons we wanted to invite Duncan to talk to us today was because I think his work really highlights some of the historical understandings of the way technologies changed work and how they should be interpreted in different environmental and different societal contexts. So it's not about issues around technological determinants, but also about how other social actors shape the way that technology is adopted and implemented. And I think these are some of the themes that will come out in Duncan's work, along with some of the more recent work he's done around skills, training, and flexibility. So with no further ado, and to give Duncan maximum time, let me hand over to you. And thank you very much, Duncan. Really looking forward to this talk.
Well, thank you very much, Jackie. My talk today is focused on changing perspectives on the future of work. And this is a vast field, so you must forgive me if the presentation is very selective and quite schematic in the way arguments are shown, but we can always fill in detail later. I'll move now to the set of slides. So I want to structure the talk around sort of four main areas. First of all, starting with the early post-war macro-theoretical perspectives on the future of work, then turning to the automation debates in the 1960s and 1970s, which grew out of those, and then moving on to what I'd call the new millennium macro-theoretical perspectives on the future of work, and turning from that to evidence on the trends and variations in the quality of work from the 1990s in response to those macro-theoretical perspectives. And I'll end with a very, very few words on the implications of past experience for future research on the digital transformation. Well, if we go to the early post-war period, there were two very influential macro perspectives. The first was the theory of industrialism, and this is associated with Clark Carr. Clark Carr became very famous later as the great reforming president of the University of California. But at the time that I'm concerned with here, he was the director of what was probably the biggest US social science program of the time, the Inter-University Study of Labor Problems in Economic Development. This between 54 and 59 had 40 projects with 35 countries involving 78 researchers, and it produced an incredible amount of material, 20 books and over 40 articles. So it's a very good example for Digit, really, of what it can hope to achieve, I think. Now, at the end of the projects, Clark Carr and three colleagues put together a synthesis of what they considered that they had really found, or the projects had found. And that became this very influential book, Industrialism and Industrial Man, published in 1960. Now, as you'll see from the photograph, Clark Carr was quite an optimistic character. And I think that comes out in the structure of his theory. It basically runs like this, that technological development drives economic growth, work patterns, and wider social structure. And the key trend in technology is increased complexity and therefore higher skills. And higher skills require participative rather than hierarchical forms of organization. And finally, more participative organizations will be conducive to greater social harmony in the workplace. So it was a very optimistic view of the future of work. Now, the second very influential macro perspective was the Neo-Marxian theory. And the inspiration of this was George Friedman. George Friedman was a very interesting character. He He inherited the equivalent of £1.6 million when he was 27 and gave almost all of it away to charities and to supporting his students by creating journals for them to publish in. But I'm concerned with him here primarily as the founder of the French School of Sociology du Travail. And his classic book, of course, was Problèmes humains du machinisme industriel. Sadly, this was only published in English under the rather dreary title of Industrial Society in 1955, so its influence on the English public was really very late. But the perspective became influential in the US and the UK with Harry Braverman's Labour and Monopoly Capital. Now, Braverman knew his Friedman, and the structure of his argument is at times remarkably close to Friedman's, although I must say that he's not a good example of good citation, since he only gives him a footnote. But Braverman did also change the thesis in that he extended it to sectors of non-manual work and the service sector. But Friedman's students basically became the leading researchers in French sociology of work for the next 20 years. And their influence, of course, it had an enormous effect on continental sociology of work more generally. He has, as you can see, a much more skeptical look to his face. Friedman's general view was this, that he took the Neo-Marxian view, or what later became known as the labour process view, that technological development is actually determined by employer strategies of profit maximization, and it will therefore be designed to reduce workers' control of the work process. It will lead to a degradation of task quality and work conditions, that in turn will lead to what they call objective alienation. That's the separation of the worker from the means and processes of production. The reaction to this, they thought, could take quite varied forms. I mean, it might be that it would be resistance, sabotage, or it might be a shift to a rather economistic, instrumentalist approach to work, where people simply withdrew from involvement in work. Now, although these theories were quite radically different in many ways, they were common assumptions. Both of them saw the future of work as primarily determined by manufacturing. And this was rather unfortunate, given that services overtook manufacturing as a source of employment in most European countries in the 1960s and 1970s, with these European countries following in the 1980s. They both depicted technological change as the main immediate determinant of patterns of work organization, affecting workers' skills and decision-making discretion. And this underpins their crucial belief that developments in work would be very similar in different advanced capitalist societies. So they share some of these key common assumptions, and we'll see that some of these are very questionable. Now, in those days, there was nothing available for looking at representative change in the in patterns of work. So the strategy that researchers adopted was to make case studies of prototypical cutting-edge technologies. And they presented these really as exemplars of the way that work more generally would change as these technologies rolled out across the economy. And the general consensus was that the key transition was between traditional mass production, which was labor intensive, where work was low skilled and highly repetitive, and where workers were tied to the rhythm of the assembly line, to work in automated mass production, it was capital intensive, where workers were highly skilled, and where workers could work in a way which was independent of the rhythm of the machine. And as you'll see from the photo, there are not an awful lot of workers actually sort of visible. There are actually 3 workers, I think, in the photo, which you could see if you had a microscope. It does sort of show the change in the way the technology relates to human beings. Now, this led into the automation debate of the 1960s and 70s. And as with the macro perspectives, and I think deeply embedded in them, there emerged 2 quite distinct long-term predictions about the effects of automation on the nature of work and work experiences. Researchers in the US, like Blauner, and the UK, Woodward, concluded that it reversed the trend to a detailed division of labour, improved the quality of work, reduced tensions between management and workers, and led to improved industrial relations. In contrast, French researchers, like Mallet and Nuffield, concluded that it heightened the awareness of alienation in work and led to more radical worker militancy. Now, what were the sort of key arguments underpinning these highly contrasting positions? Well, the most influential US text was Robert Blauner's Alienation and Freedom, published in 1964. And the argument ran like this, that automation reduces physical hardship, so that takes away one of the worst sources of resentment in work, that it liberates the workers from the rhythm of the machine, as I said earlier, but it gave them, as a result of that, control over their own movements and over their work schedules. And even more important, it restored initiative and choice over techniques. And it provided opportunities for learning and self-actualization. And thus it restored the meaningfulness in work compared to traditional mass production technologies. Further, it replaced repressive supervision with team control, which he saw as a very good thing, leading to much more supportive relations between colleagues, and creating a new type of relationship with supervision, which was one of consultation rather than the old repressive forms of supervision. And finally, and I think this is very important, it makes labour a fixed and a relatively minor cost, relative, of course, to the hugely expensive capital equipment being used. And this meant that it was easy for employers to give high levels of job security, and they needed to do so, and to give more generous terms of employment in terms of pay and fringe benefits. So the combination of these factors led to greater social harmony in the workplace. There was some very important British research on automation which came to almost identical conclusions by Joan Woodward and her team in Imperial College. And it included an additional element to the explanation, which I think is quite interesting, that automation incorporates technical coordination into the machinery itself and controls and transforms the control system. It makes the control system less fragmented, so there are fewer conflicts imposed on workers in terms of expectations about quantity and quality of their work. And it's less personalized, since control is internalized into the technology. Supervision could become consultative rather than repressive, making relations in the workplace more harmonious. So how come that the French came up with such different conclusions? Well, I think the most interesting, there are different versions of the French thesis, but the most interesting was that by Pierre Naville, who led the biggest research program into automation. And his argument was this, that automation actually involves a final rupture between the producer and the product, which was seen as one of the great sources of objective alienation. It primarily involved monitoring work. He agreed with Blauner in that respect, but he thought his studies showed that monitoring work was frequently boring, lonely, and above all, it was mentally stressful. There was also a change in terms of the mobility with which workers were treated. So monitoring work involving whole complexes of machinery encouraged managers to use a multifunctional use of labour, in particular by introducing polyvalent work. And this had the effect of undercutting people's task identities, which were very important to them. It also encouraged work in small teams, much as Blauner said, but from Naville, this was not a good thing, but involved repressive control by colleagues. And finally, the dissociation between the organisation of machinery and the organisation of work made managerial choice in organisational structure more transparent and therefore more easily contestable. So you'll see that they agreed on many of the facts that were happening about work processes, but actually drew very different interpretations of what that meant for workers' experiences. Now, my own contribution to this research agenda, which was published as In Search of a New Working Class, was an attempt to sort of understand the paradox of these strongly contrasting predictions. And it involved a comparison of 4 oil refineries belonging to one company, BP, and face-to-face interviews with 200 randomly selected employees in each refinery. there were also interviews with managers and unions. And I looked over the industrial relations documentation for the previous 10 years. And to give you some flavor of the specific findings that emerged, I suppose one, and this was really crucial, was that decisions about work organization and pay were taken by managerial diktat in France, but through negotiation with worker representatives in Britain. And this had some important consequences. The lower participation of decisions of French workers was associated with much stronger resentments about work conditions, regularly resulting in strike action over shift work schedules, manning levels and pay, whereas strikes were virtually unknown in Britain. And while the British workers generally accepted the existing structure of decision-making as legitimate, French workers wanted an extension of worker control over both organisational and strategic decisions. So what the study found was that there were substantial variations in the implications of automation for work practices and experiences, reflecting institutional and cultural differences. So general conclusions by the 1990s was that the predictive power of the early post-war theories of future of work proved rather weak. Case study research on automation, also on other technologies, for instance, the major studies of the automobile industry, which were coordinated from MIT, showed that technology per se does not determine the structure of work practices and of work organization. And managerial practices were strongly influenced by wider institutional structures and institutional norms. So I want to move on now, jumping several decades to what I've called New Millennium Macro-Theoretical Perspectives on the future of work. They were, of course, largely developed in the 1990s. By the turn of the millennium, the post-war macro perspectives have been replaced by two new paradigms. The theory of the knowledge economy, which I think can be dated back to Daniel Bell's work, but developed by Castells and Aomer, and particularly by Lundvall, Begdoki Lundvall, into versions with ICT as the key driver. So again, technologically driven. The second were theories of flexible employment, which was not technologically driven, as I'll show you, but provided a strongly pessimistic contrast to the theory of the knowledge economy, which had inherited very much the optimism of the original Clark-Carr thesis of industrialism. So what were the basic assumptions of theory of the knowledge economy? Well, knowledge, particularly in the form of ICT innovation, was seen as increasingly important for growth and competitiveness. And one implication of that was seen to be rising skills with increasing share of professional, managerial, and technical occupations, and a reduction in the proportion of manual workers within the workforce. And you get very similar predictions, of course, in the theory of skill-biased technological change. But the further development, and this I think was primarily driven by Lundvall, was that the need for full utilization of skills for innovation requires major organizational transformations. It requires discretionary learning organizational systems, which provide active involvement of employees in decision-making and continuous learning and skill development. So this was a broadly optimistic perception of the future of work, a renewal of the old industrialism thesis with new assumptions. And in contrast, we again have a pessimistic view, which is a theory of flexible employment. Now, this emphasizes not so much technology as growing internationalization, competitive pressure, and market volatility, as giving primary importance to flexibility to offset market risks and provide very rapid adaptation to change. And this flexibility took several forms. There was increased flexibility arising from change from rigid specialized task structures to more polyvalent work roles, an increased emphasis on short-term temporary contracts, and of course the growth of outsourcing so that the outsourcers could bear the brunt of downturning. The flexibility policies were overall thought to lead to higher levels of job insecurity. They led to increased fragmentation of the workforce into categories with different contracts, and and they reduce the capacity for worker resistance. So that, in a very sort of schematic way, I think, are the core arguments there. Now, I want to turn to this issue of how far the empirical evidence that was gathered in the following period actually confirms or disconfirms some of these key assumptions. And first, I want to take whether or not we find evidence of rising skills, learning and participation in knowledge economy. Now, in contrast to the earlier period, where research was necessarily entirely based on case studies, from the 1990s, there increasingly became available major national surveys, representative national surveys of work practices. And these were repeated fairly regularly, so they gave us evidence on trends. Now I'm going to focus on evidence in the British skills and employment surveys, but you get very similar patterns to the ones I'm about to describe from the major French and Finnish national work surveys, at least with respect to some of the key dimensions of work. So skills, by the way, the survey questionnaire for the skills and employment surveys really inherited very much the work put in by the team that ran the Social Change and Economic Life Initiative in the 1980s. And they developed a questionnaire called the Work Attitudes Survey, and the people who contributed to that were a very high-powered group, including a certain Jill Rubery and Brendan Birchall. So in part what I'm about to say owes a lot to their very valuable input over that survey. One of the questions which is used most frequently as an indicator of skill, but there are plenty of others, is what sort of qualifications people would be required for the type of job the worker was doing if somebody were to apply today. So that is, they need to update the requirements that would be insisted upon by an employer hiring somebody today. And if we look at that, we find the following sort of pattern across time. And I put in the 1986 Skelly Social Change and Economic Life Initiative survey as a start point there. And we can see that there have been regular surveys up to 2017. And the slightly darker line is that of required higher education. And as you can see, this very much rose, as would be expected in the light of the knowledge economy thesis, right across the period from 1986 to 2012. It then, oddly enough, didn't rise very much subsequently to that, between 2012 and 2017, which raises some interesting issues. And of course, you see exactly the reverse tendency with respect to no qualification, which fell very sharply between 1986 and 2012, and again leveled off in the 2012-2017 period. But I think one can say, well, that's not bad in terms of consistency with the expectations of the knowledge economy thesis. So what about its other key arguments about participation and learning? Well, one can distinguish between two key aspects of participation. One is task discretion, which is the amount of say that people have over their immediate work task. And the other is organizational participation, which is how much say they have over wider organizational decisions that affect their work. And with task discretion, there were 4 items in all of these surveys: how much personal influence you have on how hard you work, deciding what tasks you're to do, how the tasks are to be done, and the quality standards to which you work. And basically we average that to produce a scale, but take as high influence those who averaged 4, which was strongly agree on the individual items. And for organizational participation, the question was, how much say would you have over a decision at your place of work that changed the way you do your job? And basically, high organizational participation is defined as those who said a great deal or quite a lot. So what happened to participation? The assumption being that given rising skills, we would expect participation to have also risen within the British workforce. But we find that that simply wasn't the case. If you take the blue line, which represents task discretion, high task discretion, we find that it fell very steeply in the 1990s. It then leveled off until 2012, and then it fell again between 2012 and 2017. So this is absolutely the reverse of what you would expect from the knowledge economy thesis. The pattern with respect to organizational influence is a bit different. It bobs up and down, but what is interesting is if you take where it was in 2017, the proportion of employees who said that they had a great deal or quite a lot of say, it's almost the same, a little bit lower than in 1992. So it's very difficult to see this as a scenario of rising levels of participation, whichever form of participation one takes. What about skill development? Well, I've taken here the ONS estimates on the proportion of employees who receive job-related training, taking the quarterly average for each period of between April and June. If we look at the 1990s, this seemed to follow the sort of assumptions of knowledge economy theory rather well. There was a huge rise in the proportion of employees being trained. But then after the turn of the century, it sort of just went down and down and down. So again, we find no confirmation there of a strongly rising trend in learning, as one might expect, given the discretionary learning hypothesis. What about the more pessimistic thesis of the growth of flexible work in Britain? Well, there clearly was a very important overall growth in non-standard employment since the 1980s. What is a bit less clear is the impact on the quality of work of this. And our surveys, I think, are less good in terms of following the flexibility thesis than that of the knowledge economy, in that we have no good indicators in British surveys of the extent of the growth of polyvalent work, for instance, or mobility within the workplace, or indeed of the effects, for instance, of working for subcontractors on task quality. But what we can look at are the broad trends in job security. And of course, this is quite fundamental to many of people's worries about the implications of flexibility. And we could take two indicators, temporary work contracts on the one hand and subjective job insecurity on the other. And this is the picture we get. The blue columns represent the proportion of employees that we found in temporary work in each period, and the red column, the proportion of employees who regard their work as insecure. That's to say, they think there's an even or higher chance of losing their job in the next 12 months. Now, if we take first temporary work, we see again there was quite a striking rise between 1986 and 1992, but then it declined, and it was relatively constant actually between 1997 and 2012, with a slight dip again to 2017, which was the lowest point of in terms of the proportion of employees in temporary work in our data. If we turn to job insecurity, I mean, the first striking thing, of course, is that job insecurity was much more widespread than the proportion of people in temporary contracts, suggesting that there's quite a substantial people in so-called permanent or regular jobs were also insecure. But again, we don't really find any confirmation of declining overall job insecurity or a trend to decline. There are periods when it declined and periods when it rose. But if we take 2017, it's actually lower than in any previous period. So again, I don't think the evidence is very supportive of some of the most fundamental worries there about job security that came out of the flexible employment systems thesis. Now, the period subsequently to 2000 has also been interesting because, as well as much better trend data, we've also seen a major extension of comparative European research. And that's thanks to the availability of large-scale representative surveys, such as the ESS, the European Social Survey, and the EWCS, the European Working Conditions Survey. Actually, one of the worrying things is we're now leaving the EU, and we're not likely to be included in data from at least the second of those. Now, what has come I think from the research on those is the fact that there are very substantial and indeed persistent differences in employment practices in different parts of Europe. And just to give you an example here, for instance, of the proportion of employees in high and low involvement organizations by European region in 2015. I'm drawing here on work, a report to Eurofound that I did with Ying Zhou this year, and has been published this year. And basically, for presentation, I've grouped this into the UK, Nordic countries, continental countries, southern countries, and divided the East European countries into 3 groups, North, Central, and South. And as you can see, I mean, the biggest divide of all is between the Southern and Eastern European countries on the one hand and the sort of Western, Northern regions on the other. But it's quite striking how substantial these variations are. I mean, in the Southern and Eastern countries, low involvement organizations hugely overwhelm the proportion of employees in high involvement organizations, which are the blue column. And if we take, even within the Western group, you can see there are very substantial differences between the Nordic countries and the continental, where the Nordic countries really stand out as the exceptional case. And you can see here, they have the highest proportion of employees in high involvement organizations, 40%, and the lowest proportion in low involvement organizations. So it's actually quite different even from the continental countries, Germany and Benelux, although you might argue that technically they're more or less at the same level. So that's the case for high and low involvement organizations. I should perhaps explain that high involvement organizations are those where employees were above the median for both task discretion and organizational participation. And low involvement is where they were below the median for both of those. But you get a very, very high level of variation across Europe. If we turn to the proportion of employees receiving training, we get exactly the same type of picture emerging. Very low levels of training in Southern and Eastern Europe, and quite a lot of variation even in Western and Northern Europe, with again, the Nordic countries really standing out here as having exceptionally high levels of training, over 60% of employees getting training within the previous 12 months. The blue column here represents 2004 and the red column 2010. And I think it shows you just how stable the patterns are over time. This is a period of huge economic crisis. We thought there'd be big ruptures, but actually these national patterns proved very resistant to change. And we can look at the proportion of employees on temporary contracts. Well, this would probably be very well known to you, but they vary hugely across Europe. I mean, contrast the UK, where it's under 10%, to the Southern and East European countries. But even between the UK, the Nordic countries, and the continental, there are very, very big differences. And again, despite the great economic crisis of 2008, the patterns remain very stable across time. So what are the major conclusions raised in the so-called Millennium Perspectives? Well, the assumption underlying knowledge economy theory that rising levels of skill necessarily lead to rising employee task discretion and participation and greater skill development opportunities. It was incorrect for Britain. And with respect to task discretion, when I've looked at the data, it was also incorrect for France and Finland. There's also little evidence of a substantial growth of job insecurity from the 1990s to 2017, as would be expected from theories of the growth of flexible employment. Of course, you're in the business of working out what has happened really since 2017. However, consistent evidence emerges of substantial differences between parts of Europe in levels of participation, in training, and in job security, suggesting, I think, that institutional and cultural differences have a significant effect on management practices. So that leads me really to my brief words about past experience and future research, which of course in Britain is going to be digit. I think in the past, it's clear that long-term forecasts have proved highly inaccurate. And in part, this is because they underestimated the importance of institutional structures and policy. The forecasts, to my mind, about the implications of the new wave of digitalization are likely to be even more difficult. And that's because of the sheer diversity of its forms. And this is put well, I think, by Fernandez Macias in his Eurofound report of 2017. And I think what you've seen in the last 2 seminars that you received is that there's a huge diversity even within specific forms. For instance, platform work. If you take Judith Shaw's presentation, there are really very, very big variations, both in the type of work involved and in the sort of investment of workers in those forms of work. So in terms of their time and income. So I think one has to be extremely careful about generalizing out from particular so-called advanced cases to the future. Now, what does it tell us methodologically? Well, I think what we've learned methodologically is qualitative research is absolutely essential for capturing new processes and understanding mechanisms. I really do think that. But we do need to consider for each case study that we do that their representativeness. And to my mind, this is best done through creating linkages with national surveys. Now, Digit is in a strong position because you are going to have an employer survey. And what I would urge you really is to reflect very hard upon and to every extent possible, build in linkages in your case studies and to the national survey so that you can get some idea of where these organizations are in the broader picture of things. And finally, cross-cultural research is essential for exploring the significance of institutional and policy differences, given what we've seen, the strong country variations in prevailing employment practices. And there is some cross-cultural research in Digit, but maybe it would be nice to have a bit more, perhaps by teaming up with people, like-minded people in other countries. So that's the end of my talk, and let's go back to discussion. Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you, Duncan, very much. As expected, it was an excellent talk about, I think, some of the very important long-term influences on how we understand some of these developments. And I think it's also really important because currently that a lot of these debates are somewhat myopic in that they've forgotten some of these debates from the 1970s and how similar arguments are being rehearsed in a contemporary environments. And maybe, I suppose what I wanted to get out of this talk is how can we learn from what we knew in the past theoretically, and what kinds of empirical evidence can we bring to bear to say how useful are those theories, what kind of empirical evidence we have now. So you've excelled beyond my wildest expectations, what I would like you to do. So first of all, it's also lovely to have so many people on this webinar. And if you'd like to ask questions, you're very welcome to use the Q&A section. Or if you would like to just put your hand up, then I will just call on you and you can ask the questions yourself. So please fire ahead. If anybody has any questions, whatever level you are at, or please feel free to go ahead and ask those. And while we're briefly waiting for people to maybe formulate their questions based on the very rich evidence you've brought, I wanted to ask a question which, if I can take the cheek to maybe just share this screen if I'm allowed, maybe not. I wanted to look at your chart on this one here. Can everybody see that? Can you see that, Duncan?
Yep.
Right, this is one you sent us of employees in high and low involvement organisations by the European regions in 2015. So my question here was, could you explain this a bit more detail to us here, what this means for the UK? So we have, relatively speaking, quite a lot of people in low involvement organisations, but also, relatively speaking, quite a lot of people in high involvement. We're not as high as the Nordic countries, but could you help explain what does that mean, what we're seeing here in the UK?
Well, I think it means that in fact, a lot of liberal theories assume that the UK would be a basket case in terms of the quality of employment relations. that this is a country where deregulation is the rule of the game, and this would lead to very low levels of practice by managers and exploitative practices by managers. Actually, what you see there is that that's not quite the right story. The UK does much better on that measure, and indeed on a lot of measures of the quality of work than you would expect, given a sort of strong sort of liberal thesis about employment regimes or indeed production regimes. And I don't think that we have a very good explanation of that, but what I would suggest is that a lot is to be said in a decentralized system for the capacity of employers to be more in touch with the views of employees. So there are certain benefits to decentralization. I mean, compared to France, for instance, the gap between decision makers about work organization or pay and employees is huge. The decisions about pay are made in national committees where union representatives at national level or at industry level meet up with, there's very little that goes on within the workplace, very little discussion in the workplace. So you have a huge social distance between the key decision makers and workers. Now, in Britain, much more happens at the level of the company or the workplace. There's much more of the decision-making processes at that level. And I think this is one of the things that this has led to is perhaps a more active attempt by employers to feel out employee opinion. I mean, on the whole, they're not hugely interested in what the unions have to say, but they're quite interested in what employees think. And you saw the development here of online surveys and so on to a much greater extent than you did in France in the last 10 years. So I would say that the relatively favorable position of the UK, unexpectedly favorable, probably could reflect the degree of decentralization in the country and a sort of liberal tradition too, whereby of individualization, of people being able to express themselves and giving the individual some sort of right to take charge of their destiny. But it's that's very tentative, and I think it is rather mysterious, and it would be nice for future work to focus much more on that. But of course, it's still far, far away from the Nordic pattern, where you've got a predominantly high involvement system.
And do you have an idea of what types of organisations differentiate those who are high and low involvement yet?
Well, yeah, we actually it's curvilinear in a sense that, I mean, it's higher, it's larger and smaller. Of course, smaller is more. So I think that's true in most countries. It is the case that technically more advanced firms tend to have higher involvement, and that's always been, as far as I can go, it goes back for some time. It's there's not a big sector sort of division on that. So that would be primarily the sort of factors that you see. I mean, higher skill, obviously there's a very close correlation between the average level of skill in the population of the workforce and the extent to which there's high involvement. So if you take organizations where primarily managers and professionals are employed, then you'll find that there are higher levels of involvement. And that's true in all countries. So it doesn't really explain much of the differentiation between countries.
Well, great. I've got a flurry of questions now coming in. So I'm going to let people know who's coming in. Joe Ellery from the ESRC, would you like to unmute yourself to ask what's to be optimistic about the future, or is that enough from me? Joe, do you want to ask your question? And after that, we'll have Tessa Wright, and then Steve Rolfe, and then Jill Rubery and Simon Joyce, if that gives you and Scott Hurrell, right? So we've got quite a lot of people to get through, but let's see how we get on. And then Alina, okay, cool. Just quick off Joe.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that picking up Duncan's observations about optimism, I can see from some of your pictures, from your profiles, that you might also be quite optimistic. So I thought in this light, and it's possibly quite a large question, so maybe I'll narrow it slightly. What do you think there is to be optimistic about in terms of possible future trends based on, how you've done a lot of research about past trends and noting caveats about how this is difficult to forecast. And perhaps we might narrow this to Europe or even the UK, if that's more helpful.
Well, I think you gathered the gist of my argument was that it's pretty daft to predict for the long-term future. I mean, there are too many imponderables, whether it's manufacturing suddenly being replaced by the growth of services, or economic crises like COVID you never really expected to happen. So I wouldn't say that I have a general optimism on this. My position would be that the future is relatively open. And it's relatively open because what we've seen is that policies can make a real difference and forms of regulation can make a real difference. And where there are strong policies, a strong will to meet the challenges to employment of new risks, then something can be done about this. And there is a side component of what's happened, which gives me optimism, which is I think that if you think about the most worrying recent developments like 0 hours and platform work, which might give the greatest concerns about future risks, there's been a quite unusually rapid response, and both from labour organisations and from policymakers. I mean, when you think that you already have a independent workers' union formed so rapidly in response to platform work, when you think you had the Taylor report so rapidly in response to 0 hours work and other forms of insecurity, when you think that the EU, this amazingly heavy organisation, managed to create a social pillar, part of which is devoted to urging countries to introduce much better protection for these types of workers, I think there's something optimistic about that, it does look as though our capacity to detect risk and to try to organize some sort of regulative response may be much greater than in the past. But of course, ultimately, it depends on political will. And who knows? I mean, that does depend upon who's elected and the policy orientations of government.
Okay, so I've got quite a lot of questions. I'm going to quickly, Simon Joyce, should we hand over to you? You've got a nice big fat question to ask there.
Oh, is that working? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Duncan. It's really interesting to see this stuff set in a long theoretical context. And I was just wondering, where, in terms of your conclusions, where do you think that leaves theory? Because you've shown quite effectively that the big pictures were mistaken. So what's the role of theory from here onwards? Is it like forward to empiricism, or what do you think the job is of theory now?
Well, I think theory can develop arguments about potential opportunities and potential risks arising from changes in the nature of production and services. And I think that theory tells us a lot about the types of institutional systems that are required in order to come to better outcomes. So I think what theory has taught us is about the importance, above all, of forms of participation in societies. And the exemplar of that, of course, are the Nordic countries. So you have participation both in terms of quite high-level involvement of representatives, of union representatives, in decisions about work conditions and policies about work conditions. And you also have quite high levels of participation in the workplace. So it combines the two. And I said earlier that I think one of the potential explanations for the unexpectedly favorable position of the UK relative to, say, the continental countries, not relative to the Nordic, is decentralization. But in some sense, the Nordic countries get the benefit of both. because they've got high-level representation, and they also have strong representation in the workplace. And I think that theory then tells us about the importance of participation, both obviously for the improvement of work conditions, for workers' health and well-being, and also for their satisfaction and motivation. So theory still has a role, but it's much more contingent, I think, than the sort of theoretical enterprises that the long-term forecasters were concerned with.
I totally agree. And I think also, just to add in my tuppenny worth, I mean, I think it's really important, whatever theoretical frameworks you have, is to evaluate them against emerging new empirical evidence, and to say, for example, when we were doing the book Work in the Digital Age, we would expect Germany should be at the forefront of the runners in the digital developments, but they're not, and they're actually below Spain, because Spain has invested loads in public sector, much to the shock of my German colleagues. And then you say to yourself, what does this tell you about comparative frameworks of varieties of capitalism? Why is Spain doing this? Why is Germany not as advanced as it is? So I think it's that iteration between establishing really new, good quality empirical evidence and saying, how does it match up against the established theories? And if it doesn't fit, then we need to move for new explanatory levers to say, why are some people at forefront, some people behind, what are the consequences? I mean, it's the iteration between the theory and the evidence that brings us forward to some better, more refined, and not this kind of tsunami of theory, like there is one best way. Well, there are many, many ways to Rome. But anyway, let's not hear from me to have a little rant. There's so many people. Right, Jill's got her hand up. So we're just over to Jill. You're allowed to ask a short, quick, concise question. And then after that, there's a whole load of other people. Let me bring in Alina Rosenfeld-Kiner after Jill. Sorry, there's so many people on this list. Right, Jill, over to you briefly.
Hi, Duncan. Enjoyed that very much. I just wanted to ask really what you thought of the future of work debates that are actually arguing against the importance of work in the future. I think a lot of your talk, even in the current context, was about skills and security and things like that, but the assumption of the importance of an internalized employment relationship was sort of kind of still taken for granted. So I thought that if anything distinguishes the current debate, it's actually saying, do we still need labour, and should we be looking at the forms of capitalism rather than the workplaces as to understand the future of work?
Yeah, actually, I did play around with adding in the additional perspective at the end of work. I think that would have done even worse than the ones that I did discuss, because, as you know, the hours of work have proved very, very sticky across time, and the idea that somehow we were moving inexorably towards a society where we didn't need work has become sort of less and less realistic in terms of the evidence. But I do think that we should take seriously the fact that if we compare with the 19th century, or the later 19th century, mid-late 19th century, when people were working 63 hours a week, and the period in the post-war period where it's been around 40 to at the best 35. What we've seen is that the various stages of technological change have permitted a very big reduction in working time, to the great benefit of people's well-being and health. And that we would hope really that trend would have continued on a rather clearer downward slope from the 1980s, which it didn't. But there is a possibility now that we could try to bring back the slope to the position it was before. And I think there's a lot to be said for moving, for instance, to a 4-day week. And it should be perfectly feasible in terms of what we know about the benefits to productivity even of shorter hours of work, particularly when work has become so much more stressful, which is one of the master trends, of course, of the quality of work, which I didn't discuss, but is really very important. So I would have thought that we perhaps won't see the disappearance of employed work, but we could well hope to see it become a less significant part of people's lives. Whether you would ever want it to disappear entirely, even if there were the possibility, I think is also perhaps unclear. I mean, work has very important functions, and I know, in certain cases, other things may substitute for those functions, but I do believe it is often quite difficult. I think Brendan Birchall's argument is really very interesting, that maybe it doesn't need a huge amount of work for paid employment for people's well-being. So we could run down the hours quite a lot. But that would need a sort of more well-being centered form of policy, and how far that's compatible with capitalism is, I think, a very tricky thing to say, Joe.
Right, we have about 2 minutes left before this is officially got to end. Duncan has agreed to answer a few more questions before. Now, there are so many questions on here that are not easy to answer in 2 minutes. Where do we go? I said the next person would be Alina Russenfeld, because would you like to introduce yourself and ask your question, Russenfeld-Heine, and where you're from?
Can you hear me? Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Do you want to introduce yourself and where you're from?
Yes, thank you. My name is Alina. I'm a PhD candidate from Israel, Haifa. And I'm very interested in this topic. Thank you for your fascinating lecture. I was wondering on the future demand for social skills, such as cooperation and the ability to influence others, because we know that organizations that are heavily computerized often rely on team-based work organization. And I mean, I think that social skills might be harder to learn or develop. And could this lead to some sorting of employees based on their personalities maybe in the future? So if you could say something on that. Thank you.
Well, there's of course some evidence that social skills have become increasingly important in the economy. And that's quite heavily affected by the sectoral development of the economy, the growth of services. But it's also true that social skills have been increasingly recognized as important within manufacturing. Where we go in future, I mean, I think the compositional effects again are very interesting, of what sorts of areas of employment are likely to expand or not, and that will heavily affect the demand for social skills. But that again, I think, will ultimately be a policy matter. I mean, one might hope that the whole area, for instance, of caring would become very much more important in societies. And, you know, in that case, one could imagine that there would be a big expansion of jobs requiring social skills. But that may not be the way that policy will be orientated. And I think that'll again depend on the sort of political colour of governments that are elected and the policies that they choose to follow. So I think part of the argument is again very contingent. They have become more important. They could become very much more important if there were certain developments in the political priorities. But it's very difficult to forecast that. Whether we move over to sort of high levels of personality filtering of people, I don't know whether the personality tests would quite meet are adequate to do that very well, and I would probably hope that wouldn't happen.
Right, it's 2:01, and I still have tons of questions here. There's loads of questions around the topics from Tessa Wright and Rachel Verdin and others about how you measure insecurity over time. I don't really know if we can really answer all of those, but maybe I'd like to ask Scott Hurrell and Steve Rolfe had a similar related question. So maybe Steve says his mic is off, but Scott, would you like to ask your question about comparative changes? Can you open your mic, Scott? Okay, fire ahead.
Thanks, Jackie. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're a bit fuzzy, but...
Okay. Sorry about that. I was just wondering, with the southern European countries, whether the effects of the Troika...
I'm sorry, you've disappeared.
Have I? Yeah, I'm not sure what.
Okay, maybe it's better. Shall I just read out your question, Scott?
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks.
Okay, so your question was really, what I'll do is merge Scott and Steve's together in one last question. And sorry for everybody else, I can't fit in. So Scott was asking whether the participation mechanisms that have been affected in Southern European countries may be due to the effects of the troikas in limiting bargaining structures, which maybe aren't replicated at the workplace level. So he was really talking about the effects of how the European Union went in to manage the fiscal crisis in Greece and other Southern European countries, especially after the 2007-8 financial crisis. And that was a role really about questioning the role of big institutions. And Steve, just to wrap it up with one last big juicy fat one, Steve was asking about his conclusions of cross-cultural institutional distinctions and managerial forms at play. So really about what difference does the country make and the disposition of managers in the types of decisions they make about the implementation and adoption of different technologies. And he asks specifically, I wonder whether this is a firm conclusion or whether you think there is an extent to which distinct managerial practices is a driver of institutions or cultural forms. Sorry, that's a bit difficult. How do you make that more concise? So how would we take account of which are the most important institutions that we need to start thinking about in terms of the effects they have on the way work is organised? Is it going to be employers? Is it going to be particular types of trade unions? Is it going to be extraterritorial actors like the EU, in our case in the European Union? Or will it be the role of big, large multinationals, of particular dominant ones? So who would you say are the most powerful actors at the moment, and how will that vary between countries? I know that's a big, fat, juicy one to answer, Duncan. I don't expect you to have it all, but should we leave it on that? Because that is, who's the biggest actor in town? Is that the short version of asking that difficult question? In a very long-winded way, trying to summarise so many questions here.
Right, well, two somewhat different issues, but on the first, why do the southern countries perform so poorly? I mean, I did try to suggest an argument about this in the edited volume, Economic Crisis, Quality of Work and Social Integration, the team of us published in 2013 using the second wave European Social Survey. And my argument was basically this, that actually you have to go back to quite long-term historical analysis to make sense of this, that what is really distinctive, I suppose, about the southern countries is the strength, first, of Catholicism, and then, of course, the fact that they experienced substantial periods of fascism. So the democracy as such was not established for very, very long in those countries. So that's part of the argument that, in fact, there's a sort of authoritarianism built into some of their dominant institutional structures. And I think authority-type norms have a sort of may diffuse downwards. So there's a spillover effect of the types of religious and political regimes onto lower-level styles, authority styles. And the other characteristic, I think, of the southern countries, it's important to bear in mind, is the fact that there are quite high proportions still of family firms. And there's a sort of almost a patriarchal notion of the small firm owner in terms of the way in which decisions are made. So in a sense, I think I would go back to these much longer distance problems and to the Troika. I mean, I think this predates the Troika. Troika may not have improved it, but you're really talking about quite deep cultural historical conditionings. On the second, managers are incredibly important in this, and I think one of the great issues that would need to be taken on board is the quality of management and the training that management gets. I was once in a meeting in 10 Downing Street, actually, with Cooper, and Ed Miliband had convened this meeting at the end of the period of the Labour government. And we were all around saying that one of the big problems is the quality of British management. And he turned on us and said, well, hold on, where are you from? And Cooper said, well, I'm actually from business school. He said, well, how's this possible? I mean, so you're responsible then. And what are these business schools teaching people? What's the managers are you reducing? And I think that's an interesting sort of issue. What are the business schools and their management? Are just actually teaching about how you deal with people, how you manage people, how you improve the welfare of employees. I mean, I don't know whether there's much work has been done on that, but it does seem to be an awfully important issue. And I was discussing with a manager from Sweden the other day about why the Nordic style was much better, and he added in that he thought educational systems were really important. That actually the Nordic educational system is one which encourages actively the participation of students. I mean, it really makes them get involved in things and so on. So there is a sort of participative culture which comes up from quite early on in people's lives. And so anyhow, business schools and the educational system to look at, yeah.
I think in fairness, we are now at nearly 2:10 to Duncan, because he's been on the spot for quite a while. It's great to have had so many questions that just show how lively and vibrant this debate is. I'm really sorry we couldn't include all of them. Hopefully you will be able to keep following this debate series, and some of these will come up again. And Duncan, thank you very much, because I think you've really brought out exactly what I wanted to show, how we introduce theory with empirical evidence and adapt it to current developments, and who are the key actors and who we should be paying attention to, and how these really vary in different countries or sectors or societies. So I'm just really grateful to you for really making that so vividly clear, because that really is a counterflow to some of the current populist debates around the end of work, the tsunamis of change, and watch out for all those driverless cars that might hit you on the motorway anytime soon. If you're in Kent, it won't matter because you'll be in a queue anyway. Right, I've got one other thing I've been told to do, apart from thanking Duncan for his great contribution.
Thank you, Jackie. My very best wishes to Digit. I look forward to reading all your publications.
Well, you've set the KPIs very high if we're going to compare ourselves with Clark Kerr, aren't we?
Yeah.
20 books in 5 years. Phew. Let me just remind you, there's a poll that should come up at the end of this. If you could fill it in, that would be very helpful at how useful you think these sessions are and how you might like them to change. We have one last session next week, which will be from Professor Natchipan Subramanian on how online employee reviews help firms innovate. We have a whole series of talks after Christmas with people like Emma Russell on agile organisations, Phoebe Moore on the digitised self and GDPR, which is actually more exciting than the title might sound. And Simon Deakin on labour coding, and a whole series of other people to come up. So we hope you'll stay on for those. And yeah, do stay in contact. And thank you very much for participating. And sorry for those of you I couldn't include your questions. I'm sure we'll have other opportunities to follow up on it. Thank you very much.